Welcome to the Seed Podcast. My name is Rowena Suarez. I am your host, and I am bringing you conversations and stories about initiatives, projects, and advocacies that are giving birth to a new world. A better world, you can say. Yes, the world is crumbling and in disarray, but there is also a world that is being born. I believe that there is hope, and that in each one of us is a seed that has been planted for us to grow and nurture. We are the seeds that have been planted to transform the world. In this first episode, I spoke with Teresa Ruelas about creating a culture around food, agriculture, and community building. We talked about how that process of tending to the world is deeply connected to our own purpose and meaning. Teresa Ruelas is the co-founder and executive director of the Communities for Alternative Food Ecosystems Initiative, or CAFEi. I was with her when we founded the GMO-Free Cebu with some friends, as well as in the creation of the Cebu Farmers Market, probably the only physical hub of organically grown produce and naturally processed products in Cebu, Philippines. I was also with her in the Stop Cebu Flyovers Movement, which then became the Movement for a Livable Cebu. She is a curator of collective co-creativity, and I used to think that everything she touches turns into gold. I don't mean that shiny nature of gold, but that there is something that I value and treasure in the work that she does for the world. I invite you to pause with us and reflect in the pauses. Breathe with us and connect with your essence. It is in the pauses and in the breaths we take that we come into contact with our essence. So here she is, Teresa Ruelas. Tressa, thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you. What a great intro. I never knew that that's how you saw me, but I'm so glad to be here, Wang. And yes, I'm excited because every time we talk, something new shows up that neither of us had known before, and that's always a great joy to me, as you know.
So yes, 3 weeks ago, the Cebu Farmers Market reopened, right? And I saw that there was so much energy around the reopening of the Cebu Farmers Market after being closed for almost a year since the COVID-19 situation broke out. It was such a joy to see, even if I was not physically there, I saw how the community around Cebu Farmers Market got so excited and got so elated just by looking at the photos that the CFM team posted on Facebook. So I saw some suki, or the regular customers, who were talking about how happy they are that finally you reopened. And also even those who were not regular visitors at the market, I saw that it kind of lifted them up also, seeing that there is this community gathering around CFM. There were chefs, there were farmers, there were consumers, people who have small businesses. So it was such a joy to see. And I would like to ask why you have finally decided to reopen the market. I mean, why not last October, or why not last September? Because then, the protocols in Cebu have eased up, right? Now we hear again about COVID cases starting to increase again, things like that. There's more certainty around the protocols and the quarantine situation. So, yeah, why this time? Why is CFM reopening?
Well, throughout the time of COVID, we have been impatient to open up again. And by we, it wasn't just us who organize and run the Cebu Farmers Market. It was everybody from our customers who had gotten used to the weekly, sometimes twice a week, because, we had 3 markets in March of 2020 before we closed down. We were running 3 markets and people had gotten used. This was to doing this. This was their pattern of shopping for food, meeting with the farmers, etc. So it was really hard for everybody when we shut down. It was hard on the consumers. They had children who were suffering from asthma and allergies, and they learned that feeding them these organic food was really improving their health. And so many customers would text us or write us on Facebook every now and then asking for, when are we coming back? When are we coming back? And then there are our farmers and our vendors, right? And our food processors whose income was cut off. A lot of them live outside Cebu City, and so they weren't allowed to come in. So that was really hard on them too. It was hard on us. We worked hard to get them quarantine passes or any kind of pass that would allow them to come in. But then the problem again was on their return, because Cebu City showed a higher number. On their return, they had to be on 14-day quarantine. So for months, we had to keep monitoring the situation and seeing when the first opportunity would be for us to reopen. And, you know, we thought we'd do it in November, and then Christmas was coming. We thought, what a great gift back to the community for us to open for the holidays. But it just didn't feel right. Our farmers weren't quite ready. So we created other projects instead. Like for the very first time, we created Christmas baskets so that we could sell our farmers' products. And we filled the Christmas baskets and we sold out. So we could tell, you know, people were just really angling for it. So the next opportunity came in the new year. We thought, as long as restrictions are open, you know, are loose, we can move in and out. Our farmers are feeling safe and comfortable. Our customers are feeling, as long as we follow the protocol, you know, I'm ready. So it was a convergence of all those things that said, okay, right time. And so we did.
Thank you. I remember that you always talk about the market being the hub, right? As you mentioned earlier, everybody was just, well, impatient in a way, but also very excited and eager to come back together again. This image about the market being the hub where people come together and discover things and discover what projects they can do together, whether it's just a small project like cooking something together or growing something together. It's always been a hub. What are the other projects that came about from CFM? Other maybe projects that you saw, people who were coming to the market later on created together?
Huh. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you were part of the beginnings of that, Wang, and we immediately saw that it was much more than a trading post, you know, people buying and selling, that immediately there was a connection. People shared a common interest, whether it be in health, in growing their own gardens and food. So out of the conversations, yes, on one hand, there were maybe 3 or 4 who started their businesses at the market. You know, they had been playing with a favorite recipe that either their mother or grandmother taught them, or there was a group that was trying out yogurt, right? Mm-hmm. So there were these very small, very beginnings of a startup, of an enterprise for them. And they would come to the market and they say, can we sell here? And it was always, well, where do the ingredients come from? They have to be local. Your processing cannot include chemicals. It has to be naturally processed, etc. So, but once they came and people tasted, they would just continue to grow. And sometimes we'd be saddened, but happy at the same time that they would leave, because now with larger customers, they would show up in larger supermarkets and grocery stores and not have the time or the manpower to show up in our markets.
Mhm.
But we were happy about that. We were very proud for their growth. So there were the enterprises. And then there were universities, like students in schools who would choose to study the market for either the practice of organic farming, or what is the economic model? How is this market being run, and how are people making money, etc.? That these students would choose our market to come to for their thesis, their dissertation, because there was a recognition that something different and new was happening. There was a new culture that they were interested in studying. So that was going on too. And then as our customers became really interested in the crops themselves, they learned about the seasons, etc. They wanted to learn to garden themselves, right? Which we really encouraged. And our farmers were very eager to teach our customers their tips.
Mhm.
And so they started to buy not just the crops, but the planting materials and seedlings and seeds. So what that did was, signal to us that, we could put together a workshop that we then called Edible Gardens.
Mm.
So that, we developed that, and we proposed it to schools, to an orphanage, etc. So yes, it's those kinds of things that just kind of grew out of a conversation. Every time somebody would come and get excited, like, oh, I hate plastic, kind of thing, right? And we were also trying to really move the market out of using any single-use plastic bottles and bags and wrappers, etc. And somebody would come and say, I love making containers and boxes out of cardboard paper, sewing old tela, pieces of cloth and making them into bags. So it was really a place for creative ventures. And so when somebody would come up with an idea, we would always say, yes, go on. And how would we do that? And go do that. And how can we support you? So it was that kind of birthing place, I think, for a lot of great ideas.
That's really beautiful. And I wonder, in this time when more and more people have shifted to online selling, to online markets, e-commerce, why do you think is it still important to have something like a physical market?
Well, for one, I do know many of my friends, I think one of the things that since COVID hit and people are on lockdowns is that more people, on one hand, are more connected, right? They are able to access food that they can order. There's Grab and Lala Move, and delivery systems have shown up and that sort of thing. But it's never the same. We still, even customers who bought online say it's not the same, because the learning, the exchange, the stories about the crops and the farmers' lives, that's all part of the shopping at the market, right? Like, people who would come, sometimes they just leave their bags full of products already, or produce, because they're done with their shopping, and they're still there. And then, so I'm talking, and then 30 minutes later, I see the same people, and before COVID, they'd be kissing each other as if they were old friends, and I'd go up to them and I'd say, "You're still here." Because I got into this conversation with one farmer and she taught me about this, and now I'm so excited. And in the process, they discover something else at another table and they say, oh, I forgot, we need this kind of thing. Or they taste, our vendors used to make small taste tests of whatever had grown. And, a lot of things that showed up at the market, Wang, were things that were really local, things that the farmers grew in their own small farms that they never thought to bring to the market until we urged them, because at first the farmers would say, nobody's going to buy this. The city folk don't like this, right? Because they'll tune into the Western or what's from outside the country, etc. But we'd say, no, it's your turn to teach them what's good, what's available. And customers really tuned into that. So it's all of those things that can't happen online, that energy that you said earlier on is you can really feel when you're at the farmers market live.
That's beautiful. And what stands out for me is this thing about being able to really build community and really being able to build or grow a certain culture around food and farming and agriculture. These things, Tressa, I know this will not happen if there is no, probably what you would call as a conductor or a weaver, right? People who will have to put things together, who will have to connect people, bring them together, who will need to connect the dots and see what is growing and what is wanting to grow even bigger. And I'm asking that because I'm thinking of CAFEi, or the Communities for Alternative Food Ecosystems initiative, for those who are not familiar with it. What is the vision of CAFEi? What is it that CAFEi is trying to do?
Well, CAFEi was one of those ventures that grew out of Cebu Farmers Market. It sort of like evolved itself. Because Cebu Farmers Market was getting large. As I had said earlier, we were running 3 markets, all on volunteer time. And we needed more resources. People wanted to do food demos and do nutrition month and food month. So there were a lot of activities that needed more resources in terms of manpower as well as financial. But the other thing that also really sort of moved us into creating this NGO is the idea that food is much more than just the farmer and the consumer. There were health practitioners that were showing up, doctors who were saying, I'm tired of being a, what's the term, Wang? When they come to you and they're already sick, and now you have to diagnose the sickness and not suggest, but actually write a prescribe medication that many of the doctors and nurses who would come to the market would say, I want to expand my practice to preventive medicine. So it just felt that as students showed up and even small companies that wanted to deliver for us, to sell the baskets, etc. It just felt that the ecosystem of food got larger and larger, and there were so many parts that were like a constellation swirling around the market that we really needed, a holding place, an even larger holding place to include all of these things that were showing up and being born. So that really came out, and that's why the name is Communities for Alternative Food Ecosystems Initiative. I mean, every word obviously means something into the vision, because our vision is food for the well-being of all people and planet. So to even imagine a world and a place where food can be accessible no matter what income bracket you are, that is both ecologically friendly and health friendly, meaning it's healthy for the people and healthy for the planet. How can that be more and more accessible to all and not just the shoppers at our organic farmers market? So when CAFEi was created, there were immediately these projects and communities that would come with it. As I said, there's the edible garden workshop and schools that wanted to bring that into not just their school practice, but their curriculum. But there was also, well, where are as more and more people were interested in growing their own food and they're starting their own gardens, the question of what about the seeds? So that's what birthed a whole other, initiative within CAFEi. We partnered with Global Seed Savers, and the idea of creating our own community of seed savers, which we then ended up calling Cebu Seed Savers, out of the farmers and the gardeners, to begin to really save our precious heritage seeds, our local crops, seeds, and begin to really propagate that and to share. So that became another huge project. So we had edible gardens and we had seed savers. We also started a mother seed library because, Cebu City is in the center of the whole province. And so we have farmers up north and we have farmers down south. But the intention was, and that's why we call it the mother seed library, is that many different satellite seed libraries will be created north and south of Cebu City.
Thank you. The image that came to me when you were talking about these projects that were born out of CFM, which also allowed the larger vision of CAFEi to really come alive, is the image of the caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Only what I see is it feels like Cebu Farmers Market did not only have to give birth to one butterfly. It seems to me like it keeps on giving birth to many more butterflies. And to me, that image is really beautiful. When I listen to you talk about the journey of CFM, about the farmers, the consumers, the different players in the ecosystems in CAFEi, I always feel like you and your work, you and CAFEi are one. I'm not saying you are all CAFEi, but it feels to me like you are CAFEi, and I would love to hear from you what it is about CAFEi that connects deeply with you, with Teresa.
That's a big question. Yes, and sometimes when it does feel like all of my life is CAFEi. So that wasn't an exaggeration or anything. Well, precisely because I think CAFEi, like, a few others that I have helped to collectively birth into the world, are all part of my own soul's calling, if you want to use that word, or soul's path. It's never been separate. It has never felt like a job, and as I had shared with you, and again, you were part of this too, when we created Cebu Farmers Market and then CAFEi, I entered as a volunteer and I stayed on as a volunteer. And obviously, I was being fed by other means other than just the financial. And, when I think about every single person that has joined the team at CAFEi, each one started as a volunteer. There was no promise or indication that they would eventually be a regular or even full-time person on the team. Because a few of them had jobs, but they really wanted to make time to volunteer. Because we have a small garden out in the back where we're experimenting with different composting, etc. We can get into that later, maybe. But different aspects of CAFEi would draw people that would then stay on, right? So I think that part of my own soul's calling is to provide that hub, that birthing place for something, some really amazing, wonderful idea to be born, to be manifested, and to take root and then grow. And while that's being born, it needs the individuals who are also searching for what their seed is. Where do they want to plant themselves? What is this? Who am I that's being called to this place? So it's been that for me in terms of CAFEi. This there's this story about a chef who's a very young chef and lives, really far out north in San Remigio. And he was basically transported to Cebu City because people discovered his way of cooking and wanted to open a business around his food. So he developed the menu, etc. And he so missed being home, and he felt like even as his restaurant was successful, etc., he felt there was something missing. And I forget how we connected. I think it was around Cebu Farmers Market, and I told him about CAFEi. And he'd come, and when he came the first time, we said, whatever you want to do. So he went out into the garden and he started planting and cleaning off, the leaves, etc. And he said, please have me come back. This is feeding my soul. So that's the kind of place we want to be for many who are called to join in transforming our food culture in Cebu. That there is a place for each and everyone, and that it will take your wanting to give of yourself and your talent and your heart's desire for you to be able to find your place in CAFEi. And so I think that's my best, very long description of what makes me feel so one with CAFEi.
What I was also feeling is that part of the larger work that you do is really helping people connect with their meaning, helping people discover what their purpose is or what their meaning is. And I'm interested to hear about your own journey, your own process of discovering your meaning and your purpose. How do you do that? How did you discover that? I think that it will benefit those who are at this start of the year are probably rethinking or considering how they can contribute to the community, and at the same time how they can be more connected or be more aligned with their purpose and their meaning. What is your process?
It just came to me, this quote by, I think it was Wendell Berry, who said that we are in between stories. The old one is dying and the new one hasn't begun. And I have, and I heard that quote or read that quote many, many years ago, maybe over 2 decades ago. And I really resonated with it. I felt like, yes, there is an old story. There is partly because of the dissatisfaction with, the status quo or the mainstream, that there was a decaying somehow, whether it's degradation of the environment, health issues, the rise of allergies, etc. So there was just this, many people were saying way back then, and even before that, that this was not sustainable, that the way we were living is not sustainable, that something had to give. And I felt that I've always felt this, Wang, more of the same is not going to do it, right? So I remember when I heard that line, I felt like I was really thrown in the middle of that, the ending of an old story and the coming of a new. And I always wondered, so what is my place in weaving the new? And what had to die in me? Because it has to start with me. It can't be about let's change society or that group of people, etc. It has, obviously whatever is happening outside is being reflected. Something else is going on inside too. So I had to face the death of some of my own attachments to say, let's say the material world, etc., and really free myself to open to the new. So my partner, Brad, and I quit the whole corporate scene. We basically threw away our attachment, including 2 salaries. And we spent, a whole year living with the only plan was to do nothing, to not have an agenda, and to really open ourselves to what the universe would provide. And that's when I think the practice of waking up each day and asking myself, what is most alive for me? And to do that. What is most alive? And not be pressured, burdened, measured by a boss or a work commitment or social norms, etc. But just to be completely free, because we also decided to live in a place where nobody knew us. We didn't know the language, the culture. We didn't know the culture. And so that, again, we would not use whatever automatic or mechanical things or habits, to really get rid of that. And I know, we were so blessed to be able to do that. And I know not many can take a whole year, but you'd be surprised. I would challenge that it can happen if you were willing enough. And of course, we were trying to be really smart about it. We counted the pennies and centavos, etc. We were very frugal, but everything else, we were like really open to the abundance. So, because, there's this whole line that you've heard me say many times, and that is, don't ask what the universe is needing of you right now. Ask what makes you feel most alive. Because what the universe needs of us right now are more people who are fully alive. And I feel like if we really get to the core of ourselves, it will feel very alive, and it will be in harmony with the aliveness of the universe and the earth and nature and humanity. And that is what will birth the new. But if we are too afraid or timid, etc., to not step out of, the security of a job or the security of a title or image or what success means to people. If we're too tied into that, my belief through living my years is that it really cuts us off from this aliveness factor in us. But if we just let that all go and really sink deep into it, when we are most alive, then we're really touching the very purpose for why we were put on earth at this time. It's living our purpose. So there's a really, there's a harmonious frequency that you get to when you are at this most alive stage. And so through this time, leading all the way to my, I used to live in the United States, and I came home to take care of my parents as they were getting old and sick. And I was with them when they both passed away, which was an honor to be that. But because even then I was in touch with the aliveness. And it brought me to the meaning and purpose for why I came home. It wasn't really just for my parents, although that was big as well. Something else was also wanting to happen, of which if I had refused the call, would not have happened. And I think that's, what I believe of each one. It's not just me. I'm not special in that. It's you, and I can see it happening to you. It's in the other members of CAFEi. It's in the farmers of CFM. Everyone has been following what's most alive in them to put them in exactly the right place at the right time to birth what needed to be born.
Wow.
At that time.
So part of the process is becoming a blank canvas, right? And that blank canvas doesn't plainly mean being blank, but there's a certain dying and a welcoming at the same time. It's like being in both worlds, right?
Yes.
So that then when you become that, then you allow something to rise in you and grow in you, and then you start to hear it better.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it is to silence that noise, that static, of the shoulds and image and what other, mostly materialistic symbols that we put on ourselves that then we have to live up to or get more of. And I'm glad that you described it as a white canvas, Wang, because it includes, again, as I was saying, it's not just me, but what shows up in that blank canvas are these synchronistic conversations, meeting people and really being open. Because I'm an empty slate, I can really hear what's showing up. And like you said, I can then connect to what else is showing up. So it's not me sitting in the middle of nothing and saying, oh, here, I'll grow this. It's a both and, right? It's me being open and attracting, and the showing up and honoring each showing up, and seeing what is their core, what is alive in all the things they're saying. And sometimes it'll take a whole hour before that shows up, right? Because they may not have let go of the trappings, like trying to prove that they have credentials, this whole thing around credentials and where they graduated and experience. When they want to join, it feels like sometimes they want to show that. So it does take a while before it says, but what's really in you? What's really deep in your heart? And when they feel, I guess, safe enough, and that gets revealed, it's like, then you feel like, oh my God, there it is. That frequency, that harmonious frequency happens.
Yeah. And I really appreciate hearing that, because I feel that this conversation also sheds light on the process of CAFEi itself. Um, as we know, things that we might think in the beginning are deeply personal are actually systemic, or as what I would hear you say is universal. Something like what's most deeply personal is also most universal, right? And um, while I was listening to you, I was reminded that last year CFM had to close. And so CAFEi had to become a blank canvas in itself. Of course, there were some seeds that had already been planted, but because of that closing of CFM, CAFEi was allowed to probe into the other world that is also wanting to be born. And I'd like to hear more about that from you. What was it? I feel like there was something that happened to Cafe I last year in relation to the process that you were describing. What was it? How did you become a blank canvas, and how did Cafe I finally go into the project that you briefly mentioned earlier? I think you mentioned edible gardens, but there is something that grew out of that. Can you tell us more about that, Tressa?
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to trace what the beginnings are or the exact pathway, because a lot of things are happening at the same time. It is like a forming of a new constellation of stars where every single star was needed to make it happen. And it's not chronological either, right?
Mm.
Diba? It's
And not
it's
linear.
more, yeah, it's not linear, it's not chronological, it's Kairos time, right? So yes, when COVID came and locked down Cebu, several things were immediately thrown at us. As I had mentioned earlier, customers were saying, "Where are we going to get our food?" And our farmers were bereft at not having a place to sell their crops. And the other thing was, because we were all on lockdown, um, poor people couldn't even leave their homes to, I mean, really poor people couldn't even leave their homes to scavenge, right, or forage for their food. And a lot of people lost their jobs, so there was no money to buy, and so that was all coming into our consciousness at the same time. And with that was also this, you might say, in every path, there's always like these streams coming at the same time that you pay a little attention to, but then you get preoccupied because something is growing faster, but there are these, well, one of those streams, or I don't know, seedlings, that we were already trying to, grow, was the one that you had mentioned on edible gardens, where we started to talk to feeding centers and persons who were forming food banks. And we were asking, what is the end point of a feeding center? Is it really to just continue to keep feeding people? And if you've been doing it for so long, you've been growing people who are fed, generations of people that you're feeding, but not necessarily growing their capacity to feed themselves. And so, so that conversation had already been going on while we were attending to edible gardens, etc. So when it locked down, one of the conversations, a parish priest who we had spoken to about this idea, because they had been doing a feeding program, came to us and said, "What was it you said again?" Because now he was faced with huge communities of his poor parishioners who were not getting the food that was needed for the household. So he said, "I remember this conversation." So then we cultivated that conversation, and what came out of it was a grow-it-yourself feeding and gardening program. And the birth of that just went, immediately. We told our friends, even our Suki customers, individuals who've been supporting us and cheering us on all this time, they would say, we said, first, let's feed them, right? Let's have them really taste and experience good, healthy, fresh produce. And with that, we can then buy from our farmers, again, whose income had been cut off because the markets were closed. Now we can buy from them to put in the baskets to feed. And once they, and in those baskets, it was, I guess, a tragic time, but there was, again, that aliveness in our team that was growing it, in which we could co-create these ideas of putting in the basket, notes to the family that would say, here's what's in your basket, here's why it's healthy, what all the health benefits are, and even suggestions of small recipes for them to cook the organic produce. So that was going on. And then with the intention that we wouldn't just keep it at the feeding, we would also then, once they felt, oh my, I can eat this, I can see my children eating this, and that it felt what it felt like to eat healthy and clean, is that we then added in the garden kit and the gardening materials, seeds and samples of compost and natural concoctions, etc., began to fill, their garden kits with it, with instructions. Now, because this was lockdown, we did not meet the first families that we fed and helped to garden, to learn how to garden. What happened was, our program was then, after the work with the parish priest, Mandaue Resilience Network in Mandaue City picked up the program and said, we want to send this program to as many communities as we can out of the poor communities. And they were the ones who arranged to have the baskets be delivered to the homes, right? They were, together with them, we created this whole system of online, through the online Zoom calls. They were given data so that they could call in from their phones. And we would instruct them through that. We created small videos that they could then replay, so that when we would give them the gardening materials, all they needed to do was, in their own homes, replay the video instructions, and do it right then and there. And Wang, the beauty of it, and it always touches me, is that we were able to really be allowed entry into each and every person's home. And some of them were in squatter areas, right? Where they were practically, living on top of each other. And you could hear the dogs barking and arguments and talking, and we had to teach them how to mute the call so we wouldn't be interrupted. But it was so sweet, because then, in their small areas, 2 hours every week for 8 weeks, their children, their apos, their grandchildren, their spouses would sit and listen to this instruction and do it themselves. So there was no convincing to do, It didn't have to be like, how it is usually one member, let's say the mother would go and learn something, and they'd have to scratch their head thinking, how do I convince my husband and my kids to do this? No, because we were in their homes every week, the whole family was listening. and experiencing through food. So that was going on, and then that grew, that evolved, because the Mandawi Resilience Network had ties to the Mandawi Chamber of Commerce, and the mayor was very much a strong supporter of our program. The Mandawi Chamber of Commerce said, what can we do? Right? We're businesses. What can we do? Well, what came out of that question were 3 companies that volunteered to be prototypes, in which they donated the space in front of their office and factory. One company donated their own rooftop to convert them into gardens by training unemployed people outside their company to become the gardeners. So what came out of that were 3 community gardens, you know, and the other 2, by the way, were of their employees who were cut off from their homes. They were living in the company that they were working for. And because their hours would end at 5 o'clock, there was nowhere to go. And these were young people. And on the weekends, there was nowhere to go. The owner of the company said, let's use this time. Who wants to grow gardens? And so these young people got so excited that they were learning to grow and harvest and cook. So anyway, I'm going on and on. But yeah, that's what happened. During COVID, we were one of the busiest organizations, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for these stories about the opportunities that were there. No matter how bad the situation might have looked, clearly, there were several opportunities that the community discovered together. And it is clear to me that there is transformation that is happening, that it's on the way. And as we close, I'd like to ask what your image is of a transformed world. How does that look like?
I guess I don't have a clear picture in terms of look, except that this world would be occupied and stewarded by people who were living out of the core and aliveness of their beings. And I have great faith that if everybody just did that, right, the world would be, just such a more loving, peaceful, nature-loving, ecologically friendly, healthy, et cetera, place. But it does need every person to come from their deepest core and to follow that path. And it needs the systems, it needs the government, businesses, NGOs, civil societies to hold those people with love and faith, to not just allow them or permit them to be exactly who they are, but to, fan their flame and encourage them and support them in being exactly who they were meant to be and to follow their life purpose. I think the more and more that we can create a society that grows a garden of very alive, purposeful people, the rest will take care of itself.
And having said that, what gives you hope that this is possible?
That it's already happening, that you and I know each other, that we know many people who are already there. And now we're hoping LGUs and companies and, larger and larger collectives of people are waking up and will do
It's
this with
happening.
us. It's
It's
happening.
happening.
As our friend says, it's happening. I don't know what's happening, but it's happening.
Definitely. Tressa, thank you so much. This has been a very inspiring conversations, and I'm looking forward to more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wang. I really enjoyed it. You're, as usual, great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you find this valuable, don't forget to hit subscribe or follow. And if you'd like to know more about me and my work, you can check out seedsoftransformation.ph.